Welcome everyone to .NET Enterprise Developer Day EMEA 2022. Thank you so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Gary Singh, Senior Partner Solutions Architect at Amazon Web Services. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. Like Eric said, I'm a Senior Partner Solutions Architect focused on Microsoft technologies on AWS. And today we're going to talk about migrating your ASP.NET application to a fully managed Elastic Beanstalk environment. So let's get started. All right, so this being, as you can see on the screen, what we see here is a migration assistant tool. And how does that work? I'm using a metaphor here. So this box here being your ASP.NET application, and the migration assistant tool that we are going to review today is being the dolly. It is going to make it really easy for you to move your ASP.NET application to Elastic Beanstalk. So what you see here is, as any good AWS demo, we are going to start off with configuring IAM roles and permissions, and then we will run the PowerShell script on the on-prem host, which is going to bundle up the application and then deploy it to Elastic Beanstalk. Now, before we jump into using the migration assistant, I think it is really important for us to talk about why. Why migrating your application to Elastic Beanstalk in first place? And why does it make a great place to host migrated web application? Let's say you are a customer and you're new to the cloud and you are thinking, okay, well, how to run my migrated web application in the cloud and design it for high availability? And how do I ensure that it will scale dynamically, that I'll able to deploy my new application safely and roll back in case the deployment has an issues? And how do I keep my runtime updated and keep my OS patches and monitor application health? So you see, there is a whole bunch of questions that we ask ourselves before we even think about migrating an application over to the cloud. It's not an easy thing to just lift and shift an application running from on-prem to cloud. We got to think about the different ways how that can be deployed. Now, AWS provides customers with a lot of options for creating your web application, and these includes a variety of building blocks. Some of them are EC2, EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service, ECS, which is Container Service, S3, EFS, so on and so forth, and different network options. As far as load balancing is concerned, there is classical load balance, application load balance, network load balance, and so forth. And then configuring those security groups to control access, control egress and ingress. And then there are a variety of database options as well to sort of migrate your database across. Essentially, we provide customers with a large number of building blocks that allow them to build almost anything that they can imagine. But if you are migrating a web application, is there really just one service you can use that makes it easy to run your web application? And the answer is yes, of course. That is Elastic Beanstalk, or as we like to call it, EBS. Using EBS, customers really only need to come up to speed with one service to get their web application running in the cloud in no time. So using EBS, you can automatically, which automatically provisions your infrastructure and have your underlying instances ready, Elastic load balancer configured, and if you have a database, you can have database configured as well. This is one place where customer can configure their auto-scaling configuration, network and security configuration, as well as application deployment, health monitoring, analysis and debugging tool is also part of that. So essentially, you get one big package that comes with all the different tools and services for you to not just host your web application, but also manage it efficiently. And all of this is offered at no additional cost. So what Elastic Beanstalk does is that it provisions the underlying resources at no charge to you. All you pay for is the underlying resources. Customers can see those resources in their account, and of course, they are built for these resources. You really get a lot of functionality for provisioning and managing your web application at no cost, which otherwise you would do it using some automation tools in an on-prem world. The things you can do with Elastic Beanstalk is you can modernize your application with a multi-container Docker environment, and we will talk about different environments that Elastic Beanstalk support. You can serve and scale a machine learning model, integrate Elastic Beanstalk with your CI/CD pipeline for continuous updates to your application. And if you are into blue-green sort of deployment, that is also possible with Elastic Beanstalk. I will talk about different options for deployment at later stage. Now let's look into the runtimes that's supported. So EBS or Elastic Beanstalk supports a variety of different runtime. So you can pick the one that matches your application. Of course, today we are going to talk about .NET, but it does support PHP, Java, Ruby, Node.js, so on and so forth, as well as Docker environment. Docker is our fastest growing application environment in Elastic Beanstalk today. So if you're going to set up an Elastic Beanstalk environment to run your web application in Elastic Beanstalk, this kind of consists of three phases, as you can see on the screen here. First is configure and provision, then deploy, and then finally monitor and manage. We'll briefly go through this. It sets context for where we run the migration assistant to get a better understanding of what each step is doing. And finally, once you're done with deployment, you just sit back and use the dashboard provided by Elastic Beanstalk to continuously monitor and manage your application. All right, so as you can see here, we talked about different environments in Elastic Beanstalk. The first thing that you do in Elastic Beanstalk is you create an application. Say, for example, you have a marketing application and you say it's marketing 1, and you have a payroll application that could be a payroll application. So just a name for the application. An application itself is really a container for different environment, right? So for example, marketing may have a dev environment, a test environment, and a product environment. You may have assigned an environment, like I said, dev or test or product. Within each of those environments, you would have one or more instances that are running in specific version of the application, as you can see in this slide here. So in this example, in dev, we are evaluating version 3 of the app, whereas in staging, we are evaluating version 2 of the application, and in prod, as you can see, we are running version 1. Elastic Beanstalk makes it really easy for you to manage application versions. When you upload your application as an application bundle, it is stored durably in Amazon S3. It makes it really easy for you to update your environment to new version. And if there is a failure, you can roll back to the previous version really easy. Now, when you deploy your application in Elastic Beanstalk, it deploys it as part of the application stack, which includes the underlying host, the operating system, the language interpreter, the application server, the HTTP server, and then your application. What Elastic Beanstalk does is not only deploys your application, but also manages all the underlying components in the stack and makes sure they seamlessly work together. Now let's look at monitoring. So as far as health monitoring, Elastic Beanstalk provides the ability to monitor not only the infrastructure health, but also your application health. And that's done through a health agent that resides on each of the instances that Elastic Beanstalk provisions. And what that agent does is that it reviews a variety of different logs, ports, those logs, that the ports that is used by the application, and allow you as a developer or administrator to actually monitor application health and look for error rates, HTTP errors, look at latency, and then create sort of alerting conditions that can notify you in the event a threshold is crossed. So unlike on-prem system where you have to sort of take help of a third-party monitoring system or monitoring tool to configure these things or alerts, you can have that configured as part of Elastic Beanstalk service without any additional cost. Now, one other thing that is really powerful about Elastic Beanstalk is the ability to update the operating system and the runtime environment with patches, fixes, and minor updates. And these updates are applied during the maintenance window that you define. In this case, we are doing every Tuesday at 2 UTC. This is really nice because this automation takes a lot of work off the plate of the administrator who may otherwise be responsible for updating their instances with patches. Not sure how many of you face this, but it's really difficult to sort of maintain these patches and sort of automate this in a production environment. All of this is taken care for you as part of Elastic Beanstalk, again, without spending any additional cost on all these automations that are there in place. Now, here's a screenshot of the various events, as you can see, associated with managed updates. So that's just an indication of how it works. Okay, so far we talked about why, and now we are going to talk about how you would migrate your ASP.NET web application to Elastic Beanstalk. What are we going to do in this example is that we are going to migrate an example website from an on-prem host to an Elastic Beanstalk environment running in the cloud. Now, before we do that, I just want to talk about different steps that the Windows Web Application Migration Assistant has. So the web application, or the migration assistant, as we like to call it, it interactively walks you through the steps shown in the diagram here during the migration process. It is basically a PowerShell script, right? And the script performs a number of steps. First, it scans your host and discovers the ASP.NET application, as you can see on the screen here. Then it prompts you to select one of the websites to migrate. So your IIS server may have one or more websites running on top of it. It's going to list all of them and help you select the one you want to migrate. It also scans and discovers database connection strings, configurations within that specific website that you selected to migrate. And it allows you to update it to new endpoint, as the chances are that if you're migrating it to Elastic Beanstalk, you'll be migrating a database as well along with it. And after that, the migration assistant generates an Elastic Beanstalk deployment bundle and stores it on S3. Then the migration assistant carries out the final task of deploying the deployment bundle into Elastic Beanstalk. So that's basically 5-step that the migration assistant performs to sort of lift and shift your websites running from on-prem to Elastic Beanstalk. like I mentioned earlier, it's nothing but a PowerShell scripts, which is an open source project developed and maintained by AWS and is available on GitHub. I'll show that in the next screen, where we have the links for the GitHub page, where you can go and download the Migration Assistant tool. I'll probably skip this website. We just talked about the process at high level, the 5-step process that the Migration Assistant performs as part of the migration. Now, let's look at this diagram, right? We have a diagram where the customer is sitting at the bottom, as you can see. The box on the right, let me build up this website. It's easier for you to understand that way. Right, so in this example, we have the database server that's running on-prem. For the sake of example, we are not going to show you the migration of the database. Certainly, you can migrate the database ahead of time, and then migrate your application. So in this case, the customer is going to connect to .NET Migration Wizard. The wizard is going to connect through MS Deploy, and then it's going to create a site deployment source bundle. And once that source bundle is ready, it's going to discover database strings and then create the deployment scripts. All of this information, or the gathering, the source bundle, is then copied on to S3 bucket. Then the .NET Migration Assistant is going to create that application in Elastic Beanstalk based on the source bundle stored in S3. So in this case, we have an example of SQL Server database sitting in EC2. The application is connecting to that store, and then the migration wizard will add the load balancer. Then effectively, we have got the customer migration as well over to the AWS deployed application. So as you can see here, it's going to configure the .NET application, load balancer, and finally, move your customer across to Elastic Beanstalk here. All right. So let's talk about, setting up Migration Assistant. Now, basically, you need 3 things here. You need an IAM user, which is a migration user, and then have that assign those policies listed there on the screen to that migration user, and then copy their access key and secret key of the user, and then configure that on the production system from where you are deploying, or dev system or test system, wherever you are deploying it from. Optionally, you can also use your backend database that your website might have, and finally download the scripts, the Migration Assistant script from GitHub that I showed earlier, copy it to your host where the web application is currently running, and let it do the magic. As you can see on the screen here, that's just an IIS website. I'll walk you through that right now, just to sort of show you how it works in action. And hopefully it works. Okay, just bear with me, guys. All right. So this is the test application that I have. It's just a random application that we've developed for this demo. There's no database in the backend. As you can see here, it's hosted on IIS, and this is the website that's running. What we do is we go to PowerShell. I've already downloaded the tool, and usually it's a zip file. What you do is, you just extract that, and you can see it's copied in this folder. So basically, this is a PowerShell script, as I mentioned earlier, that you will use to sort of do the discovery, selection, and migration. Now, before even I do that, I want to show you the AWS console so you know what I'm talking about. So I've got a environment already up and running on EBS, but I'll show you another one that will be created as part of this demo. So this is something that I did yesterday just to test it. All we have is one environment. And if you go back to EC2 console, you see that it's running an EC2 instance, which is where it's hosting the website. So that's the same as what we saw in Elastic Beanstalk. Now let's go back to the server from where we need to migrate this IIS website. Now all we got to do here is just run the migration script. It takes about a few minutes for it to sort of really run a discovery of the underlying host and figure out all the websites that's hosted on that one. At the moment, it's checking all the dependencies, making sure everything is fulfilled before we move ahead. At this point, it's asking for, I understand the font might be smaller. So at this point, as you can see, it's asking for credentials. You can either store credentials in a file, or you can just press enter if you have configured a profile already. In our case, I've configured a profile beforehand, and that profile is nothing but the user, the migration user that I created in IAM with the policies that I mentioned earlier. Basically, those policies are, to give full access to EBS and read-only access to IAM permissions. Also, the access to S3 for creation of bucket to store the artifacts that the tool sort of gathers. I click on default. It's prompting me for the region, so I'm gonna stick to US East 1 in this case. And as you can see here, it has just discovered two websites hosted on IIS server. The first one is default website. The second one is the website that we want to migrate as part of this demo. So what I'll do is I'll mention two there. And as you can see, it's just taking a snapshot of the website. It's going to create a bundle for Elastic Beanstalk as part of that. And then within a few minutes, it's going to start to store that onto S3. Now, this is the part where it checks whether you have any database connection string. And if you have that, you can choose to change it at this point, or you can do it later on in the EBS EC2 console. Ideally, if you're migrating a website to EBS, you would want to have the database pre-provisioned on AWS, maybe in RDS SQL Server, for example, and that RDS SQL Server will give you an endpoint, which is nothing but the connection string for your database. You can specify that here, and then Migration Assistant will change that connection string on the fly for you. In our case, the application is not using any database connection. As you can see now, it's converting the database to Elastic Beanstalk deployment bundle, which has already been done. Now, what's this asking you is a Elastic Beanstalk application name. If you recall, I've just shared the EC2 screenshot, the Elastic Beanstalk console. There was an application that I configured yesterday. Let's do this. Let's name it EMEA demo, so we know this is the one that's being configured now. What you'll see is now in Elastic Beanstalk, okay, before we go there, it's prompting us to sort of choose the operating system version where you want to run this application on. it's another way to sort of upgrade your you know underlying OS, if that supports the newer version of operating system. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you have a website running on Windows Server 2016 and you want to test it on Windows Server 2019, this is a quick way to test it. And if it all works fine, it's great. If not, then you may have to make some changes to your application. So in this case, I'm going to pick up 6, which is Windows Server 2019. And it's going to create the bundle for this specific operating system version. And finally, it's prompting me to specify the instance type that I want to run this on. I'll go with default in this case, which is T3 medium. You can choose to run it on a bigger instance type as well. And here we have an option to configure the environment type. So whether you want this to be a single instance, just by itself, or you want it to be load balanced instance, so maybe running multiple instances hosting the same website, fronted with a load balancer, so you can manage the traffic. Let's go with single in this case. And as you can see now, it's configuring the new Elastic Beanstalk environment for us. And once that environment is created, it's going to take a few minutes for the environment to be up and running, which we can see here, as well as on the console. Just a sec, I'll walk you through that as well. As you can see here, in the environment earlier, we just have one option. Now we have the EMEA demo app environment that's still in a pending save. So in the backend, it's trying to spin up an EC2 instance. And once the EC2 instance is spun up, it's going to use MS deploy to deploy the website on top of it, and then configure all the metrics for you to monitor the health of the website. Let's look at EC2 instance here. If you remember earlier, we had 2 instances running. As you can see here now, there is a third one, which is the EMEA demo, same as the application name on EBS. Now, while it's doing that, I will just walk you through the slide deck, which talks about the different deployment options available on Elastic Beanstalk. All right. So let me just start from where we left. So I'm just going to jump on to a few slides here. Now, as you can see here, it's just talking about what you essentially did to migrate the website across. All you have to do is run this PowerShell script, which does the magic of collecting all the information. And about 5 minutes later, you will see that the website is up and running on Elastic Beanstalk. While we are going through this slide, it's happening in the background. We'll come back to it and have a look at that. Now, let's look at option for deploying applications, on Elastic Beanstalk. So we have a variety of deployment options, as I mentioned earlier. These includes deploying all at once. So if you have a fleet of fleet event, you can deploy them all at once without having a sort of split sort of deployment scenario. Or you can do rolling deployments where you update a portion of the fleet, evaluate the health status before moving on to the next segment of that fleet. You can also do rolling deployment with additional batch, where you can provide additional instances beyond those that are provisioned in the fleet to provide additional capacity as you provide updates. You can do immutable updates, where you create an entirely new autoscaling group, deploy to a new group before decommissioning the old one. And then finally, you have blue-green deployment, which allows you to rotate or flip your traffic between 2 different environments. So in the previous example, you saw staging environment, where we were talking about earlier, and a prod environment. And Elastic Beanstalk sort of allows you to flip traffic between these two. Now, I'll talk about all these scenarios in detail in the upcoming slides. So the first one, like I mentioned, all-at-once deployment is nothing, where you have all the fleets are deployed, updated all at once without having to sort of split that. As you can see here, it was version 1 earlier, and now, once you have deployed it, it's version 2. Newer version is deployed into all hosts at the same time. The second option is rolling deployment model. In this case, you can specify a batch size, such as 2 in this example, and Elastic Beanstalk updates those hosts in batches. This way, you can control impact of deploying a new version and limit its impact using the batch size that you can specify. So as you can see here, the updates on the 2 of them have happened from version 1 to version 2. And then finally, you see that the rolling batches deployment, where you have the version 1 across all the fleets. And what you do is, instead of deploying the new version into a portion of the existing servers, Elastic Beanstalk increases the capacity of your application's autoscaling group and extend it by the specified batch size. So the new servers are spun up with the new versions, and the old server remain on the older version. Slowly, as you can see, the updates is happening, and finally you have all the servers running the newer version. And once the new batch is successfully deployed, a number equal to the batch size gets terminated from the server hosting the old version. So you are only left with the newer version. Now, the other option is immutable deployment, which prevents any changes to existing deployment. So instead, it spins up an entirely new autoscaling group with a new version deployed in it. And if an immutable environment update fails, the rollback process requires only terminating an autoscaling group. A failed rolling update, on the other hand, requires performing an additional rolling update to roll back the changes. To perform an immutable environment update, Elastic Beanstalk creates a second temporary autoscaling group behind environment load balancer to contain the new instances. First, Elastic Beanstalk launches a single instance with a new configuration in the new group, as you can see here. The instances serve traffic alongside all of the instances in the original autoscaling group that are running the previous configuration. And when the final instance passes health check, Elastic Beanstalk launches additional instance with new configuration matching the number of instances running in the original autoscaling group. So you can see that there is 4 instances in this case running the newer version. When all of the new instances pass the health check, Elastic Beanstalk transfers them to the original autoscaling group and terminates the temporary autoscaling group, as you can see here, where you're left with only the instances running the newer version, and all the instances with the older versions are terminated. Now let's look at blue-green deployment. So EBS, or Elastic Beanstalk, performs an in-place update when you update your application version. So your application can become unavailable to users for a short period of time. And you can avoid this by this downtime by performing a blue-green deployment, where you deploy the new version to a separate environment and then swap the CNAME of the 2 environment to redirect traffic to new version instantly. A blue-green deployment is also required when you want to update an environment to an incompatible platform version. And with using blue-green deployment, the environment running current version of the application is cloned to a separate environment in which the new version is deployed without impacting the end user. When the deployment is complete, the DNS swap operation redirects user to the new environment. So you have a better option of managing deployment of your application without having any downtime. So as you can see in the screenshot here, you have the CNAME swapping happening when between blue and green environment. And once the deployment is configured, at this point, the older environment can be safely terminated to avoid any additional charges. You can, of course, try and keep it for some time to ensure that the new deployment is working fine if you like. All right, now let's look at the console itself and how does it look. So as you can see in the slide here, the console enables you to monitor and manage your application. All your application in this slide is showing as green, meaning that there is no error discovered in them and everything is operating without an issue. Now let's just go ahead and see the console itself. And if I can get to my cursor here. Sorry about that. All right. So what you see here is the environment that we kind of deployed, and you can see it's all up and running now. All you got to do is click on this and open a new screen, and it will just take a minute for it to deploy. Okay, there is a warning. Interesting. Let's see what's going on. Okay. It seems there is an application update in progress. Okay. Very interesting. So without wasting much time here, what we can do is we can have a look at the similar one that I did yesterday as part of this demo. As you can see here, this one is working fine. And this one seems like working fine. Again, I think it's trying to terminate the, yeah, this is working fine as well. So both of them are working fine now. As you can see here, it's okay. This was another good way for us to show, how does it work when the health seems to be not okay, or if there's an issue. It actually tells you right on the console itself that there is a warning or there is something really critical. What I think would have happened is it was trying to probably update the Windows server in the backend with the newer patches maybe, and that would have triggered a reboot of the server, and the reason why it was showing as a warning sign here. So it's a good way to sort of demo how Elastic Beanstalk really works for you to sort of monitor your application health without trying to deploy third-party tools. Once again, I'll show you the URL and how it works. So as you can see, it's hosted on Elastic Beanstalk now. If you want to dig into the environment and see what's going on here, you can just click on the environment name, and that gives you information about the recent events, the status of the environment, so on and so forth. If you have a newer version of application, you can of course deploy it using that. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is probably a slide that I didn't talk about here, is the migration path to Elastic Beanstalk. Now, in this case, we looked at path 2 at the bottom of this slide, where we use the Windows Web Application Migration Assistant, or as I like to say, Migration Assistant, to migrate a website running from your host VM. This host VM could be an on-prem, could be in another cloud, or could be running on EC2 instance like I showed you in my demo. No matter where it is hosted, you can just use this assistant tool, which is nothing but PowerShell script, to sort of take your application and move it to EBS. That's one way of doing it. The chances are that you would be doing it one-off for either testing or one-off migration. But what about updates to the application when you have an application that you are continuously updating or making changes to? That is where, if you look at part one, you can upload the application bundle to update your application on EBS. And how can you do that? So you can either create an Elastic Beanstalk bundle and go to Elastic Beanstalk console. Like I showed you, there was a button to update the version. You click on that, upload the version, and the newer version is uploaded. Now that's a lot of manual step, and nobody wants to do that. What you can otherwise do is take advantage of Elastic Beanstalk CLI or AWS CLI to update that as well, or sort of script it in some other way. And there are two additional options there, which is AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio. So if you are developing your .NET environment on Visual Studio, which I believe is the case with most of customers, you can take advantage of AWS Toolkit, which will allow you to push these changes from applications within the Visual Studio environment. So essentially, you get access to Elastic Beanstalk, not just Elastic Beanstalk, a whole bunch of other AWS services, and you can use that to push the updates to EBS. And finally, if you have CI/CD tool sets, you can make use of those CI/CD tool sets to deploy updates to your Elastic Beanstalk application. Well, that is all from for this session. I'm open to questions.